So pesticides, heavy metals, endocrine disruptors, air pollution, respiratory mycotoxins, electromagnetic fields, these have all been published in the literature to have a direct impact on causing mood disorders. So when you look at these chemicals and also EMFs, really can disrupt brain function. And in this paper that was published here, they did a review of all the different types of evidence for biological mechanisms that induce depression. And they look at the level of evidence and they look at the number of studies. But the main ones were air pollution, BPA, pesticides, and EMFs. And the literature is very good on this. And it's unquestionable that they can have a significant role in people that have unstable moods to contribute to their disorder. Now let's talk about pesticides first. So with pesticides, there's some really strong association links that have been done with mood disorders. On the very top, I have all the different mechanisms that have been published that can cause these mood disorders. And when you look at pesticides, they disrupt mitochondrial production. They can basically make neurons and neuroglia lose their efficiency and their function. Heavy metals do the same thing. So this one study was published where they looked at 127 UK sheep farmers that were exposed to organophosphate pesticides and 78 unexposed to controls. And what they found was UK sheep farmers with a history of low-level exposure to organophosphate pesticides were more likely to report symptoms of anxiety and depression than unexposed controls, even after controlling for demographics and psychosocial risk factors for these conditions. So this was repeated by other studies. This was a study that was published, and they looked at pesticides, depression, and suicide. They found that depression and suicide have multiple risk factors and may greatly depend on their epidemiological and social demographic characteristics. It increasingly suggests that pesticide exposure is a risk factor for depression and suicide. Then you can see a forest plot. So this is a systematic review analysis where they look at pesticides and the risk of depression. Now, with these forest plots, when you see this line, that means there is no statistically significant impact. Anything that crosses the line means there was a direct association with pesticide causing depression. And this forest plot on pesticides and suicide risk. Suicide risk goes up with pesticide exposure. Another study was a 3-year longitudinal study of farm operators. They found that pesticide poisoning was significantly associated with depression after adjusting for age, gender, and marital status. Symptoms being bothered by things and feeling everything was an effort. Another study looked at 529 adolescent agricultural communities. Acetylcholinesterase activity, or measured acetylcholinesterase activity in depression in girls and boys. The greater impact it had on their activity, the greater depression score they had. So a linear relationship. So pesticides have some role in depression. It's not causative, it is a factor. It does have an impact. Now, chemicals like heavy metals have also been studied in the literature. And when you look at heavy metals, cadmium seems to be the one that's most likely involved. This was a study with subjects using the Australian National Database. And they looked through different heavy metals, and cadmium was associated with an increased likelihood of depression. Now, another study looked at subjects from 2009-2017, 16,000 patients. Increased serum cadmium is associated with increased risk of depression, and higher vitamin B1 and B3 had less responsiveness from cadmium than those that didn't. So cadmium keeps showing up in these large studies as being associated with depression. The most common source of cadmium exposure is cigarette smoke. Cigarette smoke is considered to be the most significant source of human cadmium exposure. Cadmium exposure occurs also ingested from contaminated foods, crustacean, or green leafy vegetables from certain areas of Japan, and water and sealed water pipes, and can be produced by drugs or dietary supplements. So rice is another major one. Rice is very high in cadmium and lead. And I would say you really want to be careful with rice when you're looking at mood disorders because of the toxicity levels. And then secondhand smoke, cigarette smoking, may not just be the oxidative stress, but that cadmium seems to significantly impact the brain in such a way where there's a strong relationship with it shutting down the brain and potentially mitochondria. Now, so far we've talked about pesticides and heavy metals. So pesticides are chemicals that can be metabolized by our body. Non-persistent chemicals and heavy metals are persistent chemicals. They can't be metabolized in the body. They get stuck in our tissues. The only way out is through chelation. But these things can disrupt ATP production. Now, if we move along to other environmental compounds, endocrine disruptors have also been found to impact mood disorders. And remember, endocrine disruptors compete with hormones and they can alter synaptic signaling. So here you can see, for example, the structure and shape of estradiol in these aromatic rings. And the structure and shape of estradiol is similar enough where something like bisphenol A can come in and bind to the estradiol receptor and then compete with actual estradiol. So you don't get that hormone signaling response. Or it can alter the hormone signaling response, make it more exaggerated or less responsive. And then bisphenol A, same thing. Look at the structure with thyroxine. In some structures it can bind. So there's these similar relationships that are there. And then when you look at BPA-free, BPA-free is just basically bisphenol F, bisphenol S. They're almost identical. There's no difference. BPA-free are all endocrine disruptors, right? Now when you look at endocrine disruptors, here's what you need to know. 4 key points. Low dose matters. There's a wide range of health effects. There's persistence of biological effects in the body, and it's ubiquitous exposure. And they go through and talk about how it can impact hormone synthesis, epigenetic alterations, hormone distribution, and circulating hormones. This is a diagram from a paper that I published on BPA. Sources of endocrine disruptors like plasticizers, pesticides, flame retardants, parabens and food preservatives, personal care products, plastics, food packaging, clothing, furniture, pesticides. You don't want them to drink coffee, plastic lids. You want them to reduce their plastic load. You don't want them to microwave foods that have plastics in them. If they're really sick and chronic, switch from carpet to wooden floors, and furniture that doesn't retardants. So this is just a diagram. This is a good research paper, endocrine disruptors. Hormone deficiencies have an impact on synapses and glial function and nerve growth factors and blood flow and M1 activity of the microglia and blood-brain permeability. So when endocrine disruptors come in, they basically induce hormone deficiency. Endocrine disruptors compete with actual hormones, and then they can cause mood disorders. Now, some people will be more prone to endocrine disruptors than others. Another big factor could be how much biotransformation they have. So biotransformation, your body can metabolize them out. Phase 1, phase 2 detox pathways can clear them out. But some people have inefficient phase 1, phase 2 pathways. The most important phase 1, phase 2 pathway for glutathione conjugation. So glutathione is critical for converting endocrine disruptors into water-soluble forms so they can be eliminated. Now, when there's endocrine disruption, then the co-active response with hormones and different neurotransmitting signaling pathways can also be disrupted and become dysfunctional. Endocrine not only impact the endocrine system, but the nervous system as well. 177 endocrine disruptors identified internationally by the World Health Organization are known to have an impact on the nervous system. So endocrine disruptors may also be called neurodisruptors. This is studied BPA and BPA-free, associated with depressive symptoms, especially in men. Men that had higher levels of these plastic compound metabolites were strongly associated with depressive symptoms. So the higher the level of BPA and BPS, the more depression they could see. So you definitely want to reduce your plastic exposure with patients that have any kind of chronic mood disorders. You also want to support biotransformation, phase 1, phase 2 pathways. Air pollution can activate the pulmonary barrier. Chemicals come in that we breathe in through our pulmonary pathways and induce an inflammatory oxidative stress response in the brain. And the more inflamed the brain is, the more susceptible we are to these compounds. Particle size of different, so when you get to levels of 2.5, right around here, these compounds in the 2.5 range seem to have some significant impact with depression in 2.5 to 10. So this one study here looked at the association between particulate matter size of 2.5 to 10 may be at higher risk for depression. Particle sizes 2.5 and above seem to be a factor in promoting neuroinflammation in the brain. So you can see an illustration of car traffic, reactive oxygen species, and then have these inflammatory responses. Those that have prime glial cells from brain injury are going to be very susceptible to these inflammatory triggers. So they're working, they could be depressed, but when they're working, they're also stuck in traffic for 2 hours each way. They're just breathing in car exhaust all the time, and they just don't feel well. And then days where there was no traffic, they feel much better. There's some associations between air quality and depression. Sometimes when I'm working with chronic patients, finding these little subtle things off some of the load of things that may be shutting down their brain function and impacting synaptic plasticity. Air pollution activating microglial cells, particulate matter coming in. These compounds turn on the inflammatory cytokines. These microglia start to produce neurotoxic factors. These neurotoxic factors start to damage neurons that shouldn't be damaged. When certain pollutants come in, it can turn on these glial to a hyperactivated state where they're actually starting to injure surrounding neurons that should not be destroyed. Traffic-related air pollution induces inflammation and neurodegeneration. Air pollution breaks down the blood-brain barrier, and as the blood-brain barrier breaks down, more of these particulate matters can then cross into the brain and have severe inflammatory responses. The study was done to look at children in polluted areas. This was done in Mexico City, which is one of the most polluted air quality regions in the world. As air pollution levels go up, they see more neurological symptoms. The alveolar and capillary barrier transport system breaks down. The nasal barrier breaks down, so the lung barrier and nasal barrier break down from all these particulate air pollution matters, and then they diffuse into the brain, and then they cause neuron glial damage. Now, barrier systems don't break down until a person loses their antioxidant reserves. Antioxidant levels like glutathione are less prone to have these breakdowns occur. Breakdowns of barriers happen first from this particulate matter, and then you get crossing into tissues. Nasal breakdown of the olfactory system, environmental pollutants infiltrating into the olfactory bulb, into the brain. Pollutant particle matters then end up in the brain stem. They go into different areas of the brain associated with neurodegenerative diseases. Now, air pollution, this can lead to depressive behavior, aggressiveness and impulsivity, anxiety and agitation. So air pollution is very real and it's directly linked to mood disorders. The other thing, so mold can release their own end products called mycotoxins, and we can breathe in those mycotoxins and cause severe inflammatory responses. So this was the paper that was published titled A Review of the Mechanisms of Injury and Treatment Approaches for Illness Resulting from Exposure to Water-Damaged Buildings, Mold and Mycotoxins. Some of the most distressing symptoms encountered by patients include neurocognitive disturbances. And when you see people that have mold illness and they have chronic inflammatory respiratory issues with mold, their mood change when they get exposed to a really humid environment, like a water damp building or a beat up hotel room that has poor air quality. They either get depressed, they get anxiety. This review paper found that the most common clinical symptom when people get exposed to toxigenic mold. This is a paper that was published looking at European data. Dampness and mold were associated with depression independent of individual and housing characteristics. Now, an animal study was conducted when they had a specific amount led to emotional dysfunction. This was another paper that was published. In summary, the study showed that patients with mold exposure are impaired in measures of cognitive function. So look at the comparison of cognitive performance with those that have mild traumatic brain injury and subjects with mold exposure. People that have had mold exposure are very similar to those that have mild traumatic brain injuries. So it's very significant. So you can have someone that's chronically depressed for whatever the reasons may be. Maybe they have a poor microbiome, maybe they have impaired gut-brain access, maybe they have stress and the stress resolved but they haven't broken out of it. Maybe not getting proper sleep. Now they're living in a mildewy, mold-infested old apartment and they have bad air pollution and they're drinking endocrine disruptors all the time. These things can all have a total impact on the load of variables that impact brain neurochemical signaling. Now, let's talk about electromagnetic sources. So electromagnetic sources basically disrupt neuron ion exchange between membrane particles, and this has been something that's been studied very well. Electromagnetic fields do have some impact on mood. This was done with suicide and electric utility workers. So this was a case control study, 138,000 utility workers in the study, and here's what they found. Suicide mortality was increased relative to work in exposed jobs with exposure to magnetic fields. The increased odds ratio were found for years of employment as an electrician or line worker, whereas a decreased odd ratio was found for power plant operators. So if they were working in a desk job, no problem. If they were out in the field, electrician line workers, there was a very clear, statistically significant difference in risk for suicide. And then here we can see a cross-sectional study also done. They looked at 115 power plant workers exposed to EMFs and 124 administrative personnel that were not. And they go on to conclude that the thermal power plant workers exposed to EMFs are at risk of burnout syndrome and depression. These effects may be caused directly by exposure to magnetic fields or indirectly due to oxidative stress. So when you look at these extreme low frequency magnetic field disruptions, lots of things happen. So this is what they now understand is happening with these ELF-MF exposures. Oxidative stress, changes in calcium homeostasis within the neuron, T-chalk proteins go up, which is a sign of acute inflammatory infection or immune trigger. There's changes in lipid profiles, stress hormones go up. There's alterations in neurotransmitters, pro-inflammatory cytokines go up and down. And then anxiety levels fluctuate, depression levels fluctuate, sleep disorders develop. And then here you can see an illustration of EMFs impacting the brain and then these changes. And you can get into cell phones. There's warnings on your cell phones. EMFs can injure your brain. If you look at the disclaimers of any of your cell phones, they're all listed in there. If you have an iPhone, you can look at the agreement. It has all those things listed in there. The evidence is there. There's a clear impact with these pathways. Here you can see EMFs causing reactive oxygen species, antioxidant depletion. Here they show the EMF signal and the inflammatory response that's generated. And then when they look at animal studies where they can slice up the brain, they can see Purkinje cells. This was the study of the cerebellum, so the main cells are Purkinje cells. They can see Purkinje cells just die off with EMF exposure. So it's a big deal. So these EMF exposures are an issue. And disrupts neurotransmitter signaling, uncouples the mitochondria, creates inflammation. But here's the key thing, clinical pearl. Patients with significant compromise of brain mitochondria are extremely sensitive to EMFs. So let me explain what I mean by that. Patients that have severe mitochondrial uncoupling, neurons are close to threshold, they're the ones that can't be around EMFs. They immediately have symptoms. Not everyone is going to have very clear symptoms. It really depends how progressed they are. Now, if you remember these mechanisms with the mitochondria, that when a mitochondria gets glucose activation stimulation is healthy and it can make ATP, the resting membrane potential is far away from threshold. It takes a lot of input to cause the neurons to fire. But when neurons are unhealthy, they can't produce as much ATP, and it's required for the sodium potassium pump to push that sodium out. So since they're not making ATP, they can't push that sodium out. So the resting potential is close to threshold instead of way down here, and then any kind of trivial input can really make them fall apart. So whenever you see a patient come in and tell you that they're really sensitive to EMFs, you know that their brain mitochondria is significantly impaired. Now, EMFs may be having sudden impacts on people's mood and other factors, but this is something to be aware of. Blue light also is a factor with people with depression in some of these studies. When we take a look at all these different triggers, environmental triggers, we got pesticides, heavy metals, endocrine disruptors, molds, mycotoxins, electromagnetic exposure, and air pollution. So when we can do a urinary pesticide profile. A lot of different labs offer that. So you can see if patients are getting exposed to pesticides, they're getting very high levels of pesticides. You might want to look for a source, but sometimes it's not that they're getting chronic pesticide exposure, it's just that their body can't eliminate it. They're getting trace levels of exposure just from everyday life. So with some of your patients that have severe chronic depression or chronic mood disorders or anxiety, definitely check a urinary pesticide profile, see what their levels are. And if they're high, then what you want to do is see if you can identify a source, and if you can remove it, great. If they can go organic, great. and then really support their detoxification pathways, their phase 1, phase 2. We use various nutraceuticals that can do that. And then when you look at heavy metals, especially cadmium, is strongly linked. So heavy metals can be tested with pre and post DMPS DSA challenge test, serum heavy metals. The challenge test, everyone's going to have heavy metals. Now, another really important overlooked serum, lead, aluminum as a marker. And the serum levels don't reflect what's in tissues, but they do reflect active exposure. So something recent that they're exposed to. Endocrine disruptors, the same urinary toxic profiles can look at endocrine disrupting markers. You can also look at a chemical antibody panel. And then you can look at mold and mycotoxins. You can measure antibodies to mold and mycotoxins. You can measure mycotoxins urinary, IgG or Ig antibodies. So be aware of that. You can purchase EMF meters for your patients. They can see areas in their house where there's high amounts of, biggest concern is next to their bed in their bedroom. See if they can reduce those levels. Air quality, they can get a particle matter device, look at air quality pathways and see what's there. Now, the applications to these environmental issues, pesticides, toxic pesticides at home for insects. There's lots of natural pesticides that can be used instead of the ones that are commonly used, usually from orange, citrus plants or other compounds. Eat organic food, wash vegetables and foods, and then phase 1, phase 2 with nutraceuticals, and see if the urinary pesticide levels change. With heavy metals, limit dietary food high in heavy metals, seafood and rice being two big sources. Avoid cosmetics with aluminum, limit consumption of foods in aluminum cans, use water filter system, remove it before you actually ingest it. And then you may have to remove heavy metals with chelators, EDTA, DMPS, DMSA, or glutathione. Glutathione having the least effect, but also being easy to purchase over the counter. And the endocrine disruptors, avoid drinking coffee with plastic lids, avoid plastic straws, avoid furniture, mattress, and pillows treated with flame retardants, then optimize phase 1, phase 2 nutraceuticals. Air pollution, use filters at home. You have a filter in your home, in your bedroom, in every room in your work area. If you're in that for hours every day, you need to make sure that those particles are removed.